On the night of December 2nd, 1949, the Columbia Basin was quiet. A bitter winter inversion had settled over the high desert, trapping cold air close to the ground, while farmers near the river put away their tools for the day and put their kids to bed. But a few miles away, inside a sprawling weapons complex called Hanford, the shift was just getting started. Workers deep inside a chemical processing building called T-Plant were initiating an unusual procedure. Normally, irradiated nuclear fuel sits in cooling basins for about 3 months, allowing the short-lived radioactive isotopes to decay to safer levels. Tonight, they were skipping that step. They were dissolving green, freshly irradiated fuel rods that had only cooled for 16 days, and deliberately bypassing the filters designed to trap the exhaust. At 8 p.m., an unfiltered stream of radioactive gases, heavily loaded with an isotope called iodine-131, rushed straight up the stack and vented out into the freezing air. The wind shifted unpredictably overnight. By morning, an invisible plume of radiation had drifted over surrounding farms, towns, and pastures. With no sirens and no advisory to stay indoors, families woke up and went about their routines, eating breakfast and drinking milk. Nobody outside the fence had any idea what was coming out of those stacks. Without ever being asked for permission, thousands of rural Washington residents had become subjects in an open-air military experiment. To understand why this happened, we have to look back a few months to September 1949, when President Truman told the American public that the Soviet Union had successfully tested an atomic bomb. The United States military urgently needed to know how much plutonium the Soviets were producing to build future weapons. To calculate that, they needed to monitor the atmospheric fallout coming off Soviet facilities. The Air Force had a network of airborne and ground-based detection equipment ready, but to prove those sensors actually worked, they needed a baseline. Planners decided to process short-cooled fuel at Hanford to intentionally create a massive detectable plume over the Pacific Northwest. This map shows how the experiment quickly fell apart. The planners wanted a gentle westerly wind to keep the plume concentrated, but shifting weather patterns chaotically pushed the cloud in multiple directions. Combined with failing monitoring equipment, the actual release hit somewhere between 7,800 and 11,000 curies of iodine-131, vastly exceeding their target of 4,000. The contamination blanketed the immediate area around the site and kept moving. Cities like Walla Walla, 50 miles away, saw radiation levels spike. The cloud even deposited radioactive particles on Spokane, roughly 150 miles to the northeast. Hanford had been steadily improving its safety protocols and extending fuel cooling times. But the sudden demand to gather intelligence on the Soviets prompted military planners to bypass all of those established controls. The specific danger of this test came down to exactly what was tumbling out of the stack: iodine-131. It is a highly unstable isotope, and it interacts with the local environment in an incredibly efficient, destructive way. The sequence begins when the invisible gas drifts down from the sky and settles onto the soil, heavily coating the local pastures and forage crops. Dairy cows grazing in those fields consume massive quantities of the contaminated vegetation. Within hours of eating the grass, the cows metabolize the radioactive iodine and secrete it in a highly concentrated form directly into their milk. In the rural 1940s, families drank fresh milk directly from local dairies or their own backyard cows. Children, who regularly drank multiple glasses a day, absorbed proportionally massive doses of radiation because of their small body weight. This diagram illustrates what happens next. The human thyroid gland needs regular iodine to regulate growth and metabolism, but it cannot tell the difference between a normal mineral and a radioactive isotope. It simply pulls the iodine-131 out of the bloodstream and hoards it in the neck. Once lodged inside the gland, the iodine-131 decays. For the next several weeks, it emits beta particles, constantly bombarding the surrounding thyroid tissue with radiation from the inside out. By venting those gases over agricultural lands, the planners turned the region's food supply into a delivery system, channeling raw radiation directly into the bodies of local children. After the test concluded, scientists wrote up their findings in an internal report, judged the risk to workers as negligible, and then let the whole thing quietly disappear. For nearly 4 decades, the Green Run existed only as an obscure data point in government archives. Outside the facility's fence, people were comparing notes. Residents who lived downwind of the stacks noticed unusual clusters of thyroid disease and cancer in their neighborhoods. Farmers watched their livestock give birth to animals missing eyes or legs, and families suffered through unexplainable spikes in miscarriages. The government repeatedly insisted that all releases from Hanford were perfectly safe. But in the early 1980s, a local reporter named Karen Dorn Steele started filing Freedom of Information Act requests, hunting for the cause of the region's failing health. Years of public pressure and legal challenges forced the government's hand. In 1989, the main Green Run report was finally declassified. The public saw the documents detailing the deliberate venting of iodine-131, giving furious residents the exact confirmation they had spent years looking for. While the details of the experiment sat quietly in sanitized government filing cabinets, the people living underneath that plume were left to absorb decades of physical, multi-generational trauma. Thousands of these citizens, now calling themselves the Downwinders, filed massive lawsuits against the government contractors who operated Hanford. For decades they fought in court, facing the nearly impossible task of legally proving that their specific cancers came directly from the facility's exhaust. This chart highlights the financial reality of the litigation when it settled in 2015. Out of the $67 million total payout, $60 million went to legal fees, leaving roughly $7 million for the actual plaintiffs, barely enough to cover medical bills. Hanford stopped producing plutonium in the late 1980s. Today, it sits in the desert as the largest, most expensive environmental cleanup project in American history, battling polluted groundwater and 56 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste in leaking underground tanks. The contaminated soil and the leaking tanks are the physical remnants of the Cold War, but the true legacy of the Green Run is the chilling realization that a government viewed its own citizens as acceptable collateral damage in the name of national security.